The year might not be over, and several weather events, like the heavy rainfall on the 28th, have not been added to this website. But as it is, I think that we're at a period where we can see it's what some of the worst weather ever. I chose to use this website mainly because this website will actually give you it the temperatures in different colors, which I think might serve as a bit more of a visual aid in some ways than the NWS website, where all they give you is monthly and maximums and minimums. This doesn't give you that, but it gives you colors. And in some ways, honestly, when you look at this in first glance, you could see how there were only 12 days of the year where temperatures hit the 90s. That's on the surface pretty good. Notice also how none of them were in August, and we'll see that come as well. Um, and um, and when you look at the coldest temperatures, yes, it hit 3 degrees, and the other time we hit 11 was in that same front, and besides that, it hasn't gotten below the 20s. So that actually looks pretty positive. Some days that are normally midwinter cold, well, they might be near average for the period, but I mean, look at it. The downside of all that, though, is there was no snow. Pretty much no snow. Total annual snowfall was 2.3 inches, and there was no snow in December 2022 either. That's so since February of 2022, which itself was not very snowy, all we've had is that meager amount. But the annual precipitation in 50 inches was actually going to go up to 59.2. When more rain is added in, it's going to go up to 59.2. That will be our 11th wettest year on record once it's added. Look at how much rain fell on September 29th alone. Just look at it. So, you could see already how it's an ugly pattern because, again, if you can't really get cold, you're not going to be seeing snow. Because January, at first glance, looking at the temperatures, looks nice. You have one day in the 60s, and you have 14 days in the 50s. Yes, a lot of lows are in the 30s, but you have a significant amount of lows in the 40s, which at that point is going to be warmer than your average high, and only one night in the 20s. And also notice how there's only 3 days with a high stuck in the 30s. Now, the rain makes this unideal, and some of these days did actually record traces of snow. Not anything measurable, but they recorded traces of snow. So, and a lot of these days were like in this cold rain format. This actually started as a snow that people thought could accumulate, but it couldn't. But obviously, when temperatures got boosted to the 50s, it became a warm rain. But this was certainly a cold rain, and especially this and that. There were a lot of cold rains, but sometimes they actually were quite mild. And I didn't exactly appreciate that from this winter. Because it honestly, at times, it felt more like spring than, well, winter. February showed promise of it being winter, and if I showed you just these 5 days, you would not believe me that this would be the third warmest February. But look, we hit 70 degrees during the month, and that day also is a low in the mid 50s in February. So this rain right here is going to be a warm rain atop a 9-day stretch of low temperatures above freezing the next day. Even though the day starts off in the 60s, that does crash. What you also can see here is that this 11-degree low temperature and the 3-degree low temperature were part of the same exact event. But I'll say that this cancels out with the fact that the high temperatures are much warmer than could be expected. Realistically, when you look at the 24-hour periods, if the timing had been different and this had been like, I don't know, like a 1 p.m. to 1 p.m. event, you could have had a high temperature stuck in the teens here. You could have. Now you would only have that like one day of the low being, that cold, like below the teens, that and you had two. But the upshot of that was you only had one day actually officially fall into the sub-freezing column. And look, you have light precipitation, but temperatures in the 20s, and you can actually have snow. And that 26-degree temperature was already colder than it got throughout all of January. But nonetheless, the pattern change looked imminent that it wasn't coming. And yeah, this shit happens. But you do actually get 1.8 inches of snow at the end. But notice how it came from 0.55 inches of precipitation. The ratio was so bad because temperatures barely got to freezing. For a lot of it, temperatures were actually above freezing, and then they barely dipped to freezing. You could also see right above that how there was another taste of winter when we had that day with a low of 23. And I personally was surprised that the New York City high temperature managed to get above freezing, and in some parts of the metro area it didn't get above freezing. They were stuck below freezing. But New York City barely squeaked it out at 33 degrees. Although I will say it's sad, that was, one of our best chances that we had. In March, exactly one day with a low in the 20s and one day with a high in the 30s. This was supposed to be a big snow event, but the day before, the models all showed that the timing was going to be delayed and it would be tough for us to get any snow. Sure enough, New York City just got a trace, and even where there was some measurable snow, the measurable snow that fell was very light across the metro area. I'll actually show you later on what some of the other metro areas saw, just to give you a bit more perspective, as this looks pretty dull, and it is really dull, and some other metro areas cashed out for a little bit more. So I'll probably show you Kennedy and Newark, because this doesn't, LaGuardia and Newark, because this doesn't actually give you Kennedy. And you can see that this is a lot of rain, but it was a below average precipitation month, because by the end of it, there was just like practically no serious rain. This is all the snow that you had. And again, a poor ratio, but it only drops to 33 degrees during the event. And look, March, you only get into the 60s. And while you get into the 63 six times, you're only hitting 63. So it's not like the weather in March ever gets like beautiful either. It really doesn't. Now April, and then you have a 72-degree day, but it's marred by the severe thunderstorms, as you can see by the precipitation. Nonetheless, this is only our second low in the 50s of the year. April 4th is even nicer, one-ups that by being 73 degrees and actually being perfectly sunny. Notice how in April you only have 2 days with a low in the 30s, and the lowest temperature is 37 degrees. This will be one of our warmest Aprils on record, but last April actually actually didn't even drop to 37 and only dropped to 38. Nonetheless, this April also had 4 days with highs at least in the 80s, 2 in the 80s, 2 in the 90s. And while last April had a 5-day streak of temperatures in the 70s, this had a 5-day streak of temperatures above 75 and a 6-day streak of temperatures in the 70s. Most of the metro area couldn't experience the nicest, and April 15th was crummy, although the rainfall totals won't show that. But you just look at those temperatures, and all of a sudden you have a 3-day streak of lows in the 60s, which includes one day with a low in the 70s. You might think it's humid. It really wasn't, but it wasn't nice either, because it was too hot for that early in the time period. And after that, you just have this miserable period. And April, most of these were cloudy as well, and it wasn't warm. But I could say it could definitely be worse. And May starts off in a similar pattern, as you could tell. But by May 5th, the sun finally began to break out. The cold period was about to end, and we got our first day in the 70s in 2 weeks. And that would be our last low in the 40s for a while. May 7th, it was beautiful. I know that tiny amount of precipitation might show you as a cloudy, drizzly day with barely any rain, because some of the other days showed that. No, in this case, that day was actually nice. And it just that there was some nightly showers, but it was 78 degrees. But May would only have 3 days in the 80s, which could be either good or bad, depending on how you look at it. There was a lot of sunshine involved, so a lot of days were sunny, but they weren't actually overbearingly warm. This is another pretty sunny day on May 24th, when with a high of 77 and a low of 53, that produced some rain again at night. This is actually a pretty bad time, because as you can tell, we were heading towards drought. and the strong, intense sunlight was actually burning up most of the April showers. June would definitely not help with that, and June was worse. Also, after May 6th, again in May, you have that one day that gets really cold down to 43. Besides that, it's pretty consistent. You also have May 20th when it begins to pour rain, which keeps it in that low 60s range for most of the day. June starts off summery, and and it's not that way for a while. June 2nd was sunny and hot, and then that came from severe thunderstorms, but it was cloudy and not exactly warm for a while. This day had severe thunderstorms in Mississippi, but just like my area, we were spared on the 2nd, but we got pretty much that amount of rain on the 6th. This is the day of the infamous Canadian wildfire smoke, which kept us down to the 60s for the final time of the spring, even though at that point we were in meteorological summer, we were still in astronomical spring, so to each his own. And this day, again, this is where you begin to have the nightly storms cross the city. This was our last above average day, though we'd have near average, but it was the last above average day until the 25th. We hit our first low in the 70s in a while, and really, this period from the 23rd to the 25th, I want to highlight this. The 25th might not have seen any rain, um, but the 24th and 23rd did. This is where the humidity begins to creep in, but again, there's not enough rain to seriously end this pattern of drought. Yet you also have this annoying rain that comes at the worst times. It was an ugly month, but we did hit the 80s 9 times during this month. And in July, every day except this day would hit the 80s, even though there's a lot of floods. Some of the rain events mostly missed the area, but it was pretty much humid every single day except for July 1st and the 11th, and then towards the end of the month when lows were in the 60s. Also, July 23rd had a humidity big with a low in the 60s. On the 25th and 26th, there wasn't really a humidity break per se. It's just, it only fell to 68 because of severe thunderstorms. And yes, there were a ton of them that could ruin the summer at times. A lot of times the high might only have shown 84, but if the high showed 84, it could have felt like it was in the 90s. It was that humid outside. You also got close to a heat wave twice where we never had it. These days had heat indexes close to the triple digits, and this was supposed to add on to the heat index, but the storms came just a tad bit too early, capping us off at 89. August, not a single day as a high in the 90s, which is nice, and only a few days actually have feels like temperatures in the 90s. And a lot of the rain that they're showing you here, like here, was mostly in the pre-dawn hours, and by 10 a.m. it was perfectly cleared out. Here as well was another example of that. But this was a mid-afternoon rainstorm, and this right here, a lot of it came in the morning, but wouldn't clear until noon. And there were severe storms at night as well. This also came in the early morning, but it wouldn't clear for a while. And then you also had this. So not all of it was as early as we would have liked, and but you could see that even though it doesn't get below 64, there is a nice spattering of days in the 60s. Like you have 21 days with the lows in the 60s. July had 7. So it's actually a very cool August. But because of that consistency and it being only slightly below average, the month, of course, would only finish slightly below average. Considering that our warmest period was August 11th to 14th, and I mean, look at what you have. It's 85.67, then it's 85.69, 88.69, and 87.72. And that's the warmest period that you had throughout the all of August. And you can't even extend it anymore because just look at it. I mean, you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days with highs in the 70s. That's actually pretty good for August. One of the days is a high of only 73, and it was perfect timing after that death ridge in Des Moines that I was stuck in. Nonetheless, September would start off on that cool pattern, and then it would get right to business. Keep in mind, these 2 days had severe storms with the city, so the precip was worse than it looked. Also, it might have been 84, but it still felt like the 90s because of the humidity. So these 4 days would all feels like they were pushing on triple digits. These 2 days were not quite as bad, especially the third, because it took some time for the heat wave to get going. September 4th was actually supposed to hit 90 degrees, but clouds in the afternoon dropped from 89 to 83 pretty suddenly. So that was the end of that heat wave. You have 6 days in a row with high temperatures in the with low temperatures in the 70s, and then when it finally drops to the 60s, it only does so because of pouring rain. These 2 days were pretty bad. This day was salvageable. This day was again bad, and this is our first time that you have like actual fall like weather that's not doesn't feel summer like in some way since September 2nd. Because again, September any day in the red is going to be obvious. It's our first heat wave of the year. These 2 days were also summery. This day was clearly summery. This day, it still has vibes of a summer downpour, but fine, I guess you could say. But it was still humid. And in these 2 days, it gets back to the 80s. This day, it's in the 80s. And the reason why I still like to say it was summery is because it felt like 85. And more importantly, you know, it's hard for it to be in the 80s and for it to feel like fall, to be honest. But then look at this. We're finally back in the 60s. We're finally at below average weather. Our low is finally in the 50s. First time in the 50s since June 10th, despite that cool stretch. We never actually dipped to the 50s in the city. But then you have a washout. Actually, lots of washouts because this whole thing was all crummy weather, and some of it was reduced by drizzle. And then look, 8 days in a row with highs only in the 60s. And this day, just the city completely flooded, as you could tell. You had some salvageable and only slightly below weather from the 16th to the 22nd, save for the 18th, of course. This rain fell at night, so the 17th was probably actually our nicest day of the stretch when it went back up to 77 degrees. October would start off pretty nice, although 83 degrees in October is not ideal. And it would also hit the 80s at the end of the month as well. First time in the 80s in October since 2019, but that late hasn't been happening since 1993. Of course, weekend washouts were annoying, but I will say when it wasn't raining, the temperatures were actually quite pleasant. Of course, the summer like stretch was unideal, but you actually had some tastes of fall in it, but it never got truly wintry. Halloween though did see a high of only 51, so you're kind of beginning to get there. But then you also look at it, and is it in top 10 for coolest highs? No, it's not. And the low isn't going to be because 45 is around average. November starts off very dry, but also quite cold. We don't hit the 70s at all. Our highest temperature is 67. 2 days, exactly 2 days, of the low in the 50s, and in one of them it's marred by rain, although the rain was mostly in the morning. Then you have this much needed rain come in, and then we have the freezes, and then we have the day where the low gets to the 20s and the high gets to the 30s. December, it's been ugly because every single time it hits the 60s, it's only done so because there was a storm nearby. Well, this on some seconds because of the fog giving way to nice weather, but you look at it when there's no rain, it can be quite cold. It did drop to 25 degrees on December 22nd. That it did do, and the high was only 37. But that was the only day in the 20s. So we only had 2 days with highs in the 30s. So even though most of it was in this cloudy, foggy area of not great weather, in the end, it actually wound up being a very warm month because of the mixes of the 40s and the 50s. We still had a low in the 50s. We still had 3 highs in the 60s. And when you look at it, the amount of days that we had of freezing temperatures, January had only 4 days. February had 12 days of temperatures hitting freezing. Were there any in January that were exactly 32 as a low? Thankfully not. March you had 1, 2, 3, 4 days as well. Then you wouldn't have any until November. In November you'd have only 3 days, and in December you'd have 5. And again, 5 doesn't seem like it's that little of an amount, especially compared to what we've had early. But but there's like it's very rare over December with that many days fail to get to freezing. Urban heat island effect is to blame for some of it, but also notice how rained out December has been. Actually, a lot of months have been a washout. A lot of September was a washout. A lot of July was a washout. There were a lot of washouts. It was very rainy and no snow. That's why I want to say there wasn't that much nice weather in 2022. When you look at days with highs in the 80s, you had 4 in April. May would bring up your total up to 7. June would bring your total up to 16. July would actually bring it up to 46. This is a significant increase. August with the 8 days with highs in the 70s, that would actually mean 23 days with highs in the 80s, which would bring you up to 69 total. September had a ton. I mean, like, you had 7 days in a row, and then 2 more days on top of that. 9 days out of 10 of highs in the 80s, which is going to inflate your total again to 78, and it's going to be 81 thanks to October. Is 81 a lot of days with highs in the 80s? I don't know. I actually generally don't know how much we had last year. The spacing was weird. October had the same amount of 80-degree days that May did, although May had a day get up to 87 while October only got to 83. Then again, with the humidity, on May 12th, all it felt like in the city was about 84 degrees, whereas it was able to feel like 85 on October 4th. Because except for the spring, it was pretty humid in the winter on both ends, in the fall, especially in the summer. Once the humidity came in a June 23rd to 25th time period, it really took a long time to clear. And every time it seemingly cleared, it just came back harder. That's all I could say about this. Now, I promised you I'd show you around some other cities in the area. Newark had their most rain of 3.1 inches on April 29th. Their September is actually not quite as big of a washout as ours, but notice how in September they actually have 6 days in a row with highs in the 90s, and they have 8 days in a row with lows in the 70s. Notice that for a second. They also September 2nd, I mean, I guess you could say if it was nice because they dropped to the 50s and the city didn't, but they also went to the 80s. And they would be in the 80s for almost 2 consecutive weeks. And as you could tell, it was a lot hotter in Newark during this time period. They actually had a heat wave from August 12th to 14th when it hit 90 degrees. So you can't have that. So they actually had a heat wave in August. They had this July heat wave from July 26th to 29th. And sure, they had the isolated thunderstorms and all that. Their storm on July 25th hit them harder. And they also had the 80s every single day. They had a lot more 80s in June, even though June 2nd actually had the same high temperature in New York at 91, but they get a lot closer to matching that than the city does. May they hit 90 degrees on May 12th. April they get up to 93 somehow. I mean, the lows were in the 60s, so they weren't quite as bad. So you had more of that cooling going on, but you just look at the heat of summer, and it's clearly worse in Newark. It's clearly worse in Newark, New Jersey. Maybe the rainfall doesn't get quite as bad, although April 29th was clearly worse, as you could tell, but the heat is certainly worse. They are having more cold. They haven't had any snow yet. They had more snow than us. They got up to 2.6 inches of snow. February 1st, they only got 0.3 inches. Notice how in a cold snap, Newark has a low of 13 on February 3rd and 5 on the 4th. But notice how they hit the 50s on the 5th. They actually managed to hit the 50s. As far as winter goes, they only get down to 29 degrees in January. But a lot of times it gets to a wash. They actually hit 70 degrees, but not on the same rate that the city did. And also just they don't always get that way. They only had 1.7 inches of snow from the storm late at the end because, again, they had even more brick snow. I mean, just look at the amount of precipitation that they had. 0.62 inches, and that's all you get, but it didn't drop below freezing. Now, they actually got 0.6 inches of snow in March. That's why they wound up getting more. It was because of that. So I just want to show you around LaGuardia a little bit. Um, and LaGuardia Airport, they have 3.0 inches. Again, notice that in Newark got much harder during that heat wave. LaGuardia, their heat wave was actually only 4 days because they only hit 89 on the 4th, but they would get up into the mid 90s this year, and so would Newark. The city would not. They had a heat wave in July, and it was a pretty strong one, with it being 95, 94, 91. And I mean, like, a lot of it was more sputtery, so they had a drier June than us, but probably wasn't any more pleasant. Um, they actually don't hit the 90s in April, which the city did, and they don't hit 90 in June. So in terms of 90-degree days, it's hard to tell which was worse. I mean, it genuinely was. But they also had the same problem with the 50s that the city did. They wouldn't hit them until the 15th, and then it was the 23rd the next time they hit them. So no. LaGuardia would also hit 80 degrees 4 times in the month of October, which I wanted to draw some attention to. As for the snow, 0.2 on the 1st, and then 2.7 from that big snowstorm, and 0.1 on the 14th. So that's how LaGuardia is more so. They cashed out more in late February.